today was actually the second time that Donald Trump was accused of committing federal crimes by federal prosecutors in federal court right here in New York City. The first time was exactly 108 days ago on August 21st in the same case when Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to those federal crimes that he said he committed, quote, at the direction of Donald Trump, who's identified only as Individual-1 in the case. Michael Cohen said then that those crimes were committed for the principal purpose of influencing the election of the President of the United States. Today, the prosecutors filed their sentencing memo in that case saying that Michael Cohen should get, as Rachel and I just discussed, a substantial prison term for his crimes against the United States of America. Donald Trump is identified in the prosecutors' filings simply as Individual-1. But the filing notes that in 2015, Individual-1, quote, began an ultimately successful campaign for President of the United States. In committing two of Michael Cohen's many federal crimes, prosecutors say, quote, he acted in coordination with and at the direction of Individual-1. So Individual-1 has committed two federal crimes, according to federal prosecutors working in the Trump Justice Department. Now, there is actually nothing in the Constitution that says the President of the United States cannot be indicted and charged with a crime. There is nothing in the Constitution that says the President of the United States can never be charged with a crime and never put on trial in court while he is serving as President of the United States. That is not written in the Constitution anywhere. In fact, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that the President of the United States is subject to personal civil litigation and can be dragged into court and into trials in civil cases while serving as President of the United States. Paula Jones established that legal principle in her civil case against President Bill Clinton. It's merely a relatively recent Justice Department tradition, outlined only in memo form, that says the president should not be indicted. And so the only conceivable reason why Donald Trump has not been indicted as a co-conspirator in the Cohen case is that he won the presidential election that he conspired with Michael Cohen to illegally effect. If Donald Trump lost the election and federal prosecutors were pursuing this same case, he would be facing exactly the same consequences as Michael Cohen. He would be charged with exactly the same two campaign finance violation crimes for arranging secret payments to two women during the campaign to buy their silence about their sexual affairs with Donald Trump. Michael Cohen said under oath repeatedly that Donald Trump was a co-conspirator in his crimes. The prosecutors have now said repeatedly that Donald Trump was a co-conspirator in Michael Cohen's crimes. And now Michael Cohen is facing substantial prison time for those same crimes. And Donald Trump is facing what? Will Donald Trump be the only president in history accused by federal prosecutors of committing federal crimes who does not then face impeachment for those crimes? Congress moved to impeach Richard Nixon when the special prosecutor described his crimes. The House of Representatives moved to impeach and did, in fact, impeach Bill Clinton when the special prosecutor showed that he committed perjury in that civil case involving Paula Jones. And so if history means anything in the Trump era, if precedent means anything in the Trump era, Donald Trump must be impeached because of the crimes prosecutors say he committed in the Michael Cohen case. Prosecutors outlined other crimes unrelated to Donald Trump that Michael Cohen committed, including multiple counts of tax evasion, some of which involved his taxi business, and false statements to financial institutions when applying for loans. A separate sentencing document on Michael Cohen was filed by the special counsel's office today. In that document, Robert Mueller describes Michael Cohen lying to Congress about his efforts in coordination with presidential candidate Donald Trump to pursue what Mueller calls the Moscow Project, which included business opportunities in Russia for Donald Trump, including building a Trump Tower in Moscow. The special prosecutor's sentencing recommendation was for leniency based on Michael Cohen's very helpful cooperation with the special counsel's investigation. The special counsel's filing indicates that there could be much, much more for Donald Trump to worry about in what Michael Cohen has been telling Robert Mueller. The defendant has met with the special counsel's office for 7 proffer sessions, many of them lengthy, and continues to make himself available to investigators. His statements beginning with the second meeting with the special counsel's office have been credible. The defendant's assistance has been useful in 4 significant respects. First, the defendant provided information about his own contacts with Russian interests during the campaign and discussions with others in the course of making those contacts. The defendant provided a detailed account of his involvement and the involvement of others in the Moscow project. The defendant also provided information about attempts by other Russian nationals to reach the campaign. Cohen spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign political synergy and synergy on a government level. The defendant recalled that this person repeatedly proposed a meeting between Individual-1 and the president of Russia. Second, Cohen provided the special counsel's office with useful information concerning certain discrete Russia-related matters core to its investigation that he obtained by virtue of his regular contact with company executives during the campaign. And third, Cohen provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House during the 2017-2018 time period. And fourth, Cohen described the circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries. Now, we have got a big leadoff panel tonight, all of them returning stars to this program, so we won't run through that lengthy introduction that we normally do. We will just take them one at a time. Jill Wine-Banks, as a former Watergate special prosecutor, I want to get your reaction first to this development and what it means in the history of investigating presidents. Here we have a president of the United States accused in writing in federal court by federal prosecutors of committing crimes. What happens next?
Well, this is the second time that that's happened, where federal prosecutors named a president, because we did it in Watergate. Richard Nixon was named an unindicted co-conspirator and was allowed to have all of his evidence, which included the Watergate, all the tapes from the Oval Office, introduced in evidence against his co-conspirators. And this is a very dramatic and big day. This is the linkage between Donald Trump and Russia in crimes. That's what this means. And there could be much more, because you have a lot of redacted information in both the Manafort part of it and some things that are not redacted by being blacked out, but are redacted because they're so vague as to what other information Cohen has provided to Mueller. It also is interesting because there are really 3 Cohens. There is the Cohen that the Southern District saw, there's the Cohen that the special counsel saw, but there's also the Cohen that his lawyer presented in his earlier filing in his request that there be no jail time except for time served. And I have to say, I fell for that. I felt sympathy for Cohen as portrayed in his lawyer's document. And it's a good thing that you always wait till you hear the full evidence before you jump to conclusions, a lesson that I hope Whitaker is paying attention to, since he already formed a conclusion about evidence. Obviously, my original opinion of Cohen was correct. He cannot be trusted except when he is confronted with corroborating evidence. So that's the other thing we learn, is that Mueller must have significant corroborating evidence in order to have believed him now and to have put forward this evidence that links him to the president in a conspiratorial way.
Barbara McQuade, as a former federal prosecutor, when you look at these 2 different filings today about Michael Cohen and you see these 2 different versions of him, what's your reaction to that? And what leaps out at you from a prosecutorial perspective from these documents?
Well, it's possible that these two stories can be reconciled, that he was forthcoming with the special counsel and that he held back on certain things in the Southern District of New York. To be considered a cooperator and get credit for cooperation, you have to answer all the questions. You can't say, I'm not going to talk about that subject matter. And it sounds like that's what happened in the Southern District of New York. Whether he is trying to protect someone else or some of his own misconduct there, it's hard to say, but he would not be fully forthcoming there. But in Robert Mueller's case, they thought that he did answer their questions to their satisfaction. But I think a couple things come out. Number one, the special counsel says, and would not say this without corroboration, that President Trump directed Michael Cohen to violate campaign finance laws. That's a serious crime, and he is named there as Individual-1 with doing that. That's not just a regulatory offense. That is a crime, that a law that exists to protect the integrity and the transparency of our elections. And they say in there that President Trump committed that crime, not just based on the say-so of Michael Cohen, but have corroborating evidence to say that. And I think the other thing that comes out here is that Michael Cohen has also provided information that goes to the core, they use that word, of the investigation of the special counsel, and that is interference with the election. So he's talking about so-called collusion. There is a Russian individual who referred to it as political synergy, but they are getting to the heart of the matter, and Michael Cohen has information relating to coordination with Russia about the election.
Tim O'Brien, you wrote the book, one of the books on Donald Trump and his businesses. You know Michael Cohen. You've dealt with Michael Cohen. What is it that would prevent Michael Cohen from becoming a fully cooperating witness in the Southern District and today be getting a recommendation for leniency instead of the recommendation for substantial prison time because he has not been cooperating?
I suspect, and this is just a suspicion, that it's the same thing that's made Paul Manafort go back on his word multiple times. I think it's worth remembering both Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort came from rough and tumble business worlds with rough and tumble clients. In both cases, they had clients in Eastern Europe. They had investors from Eastern Europe. Michael Cohen went to high school with Felix Sater, who is a career criminal. They did these deals together. We know that Manafort was tied to a number of Ukraine billionaires and a very prominent Russian oligarch. And so I suspect at some level they're trying to protect either their families or their own hides from retribution, given the kind of careers they've had and the people they've associated with. However, and we've talked about this a million times, Lawrence, these aren't a particularly smart group of people, right? This is sort of the latest installment in stupid Watergate. And I just these people stumbling over their own feet can't be dismissed.
And Ron Klain, we have reached a political crossroads here because the prosecutors in the Southern District have done everything that they believe they can with Individual-1. They have named him in these documents. They have shown him to be a co-conspirator with Michael Cohen. They have shown him to be the person who is directing Michael Cohen to commit the crimes. The crimes are committed at the direction of and with the cooperation of Individual-1, who is now the President of the United States. The next way to deal with this, the only alternative way to deal with the crimes described in these documents committed by the president is the impeachment process.
Yeah, Lawrence, and I think it's going to obviously have to get a hard look. Look, we now know we're in the middle of R-rated Watergate. I mean, it's Watergate with some salacious sexual elements to it. But when you peel back all that, I mean, this is really spot on Watergate. Donald Trump paid someone money to do something illegal to help him win the 2016 election. That's what those papers say today. He paid Michael Cohen money to violate the campaign finance laws and cover up these two affairs he had by paying off women to help him win the 2016 election. And, it doesn't really matter whether or not the information coming out would have changed minds or not. Watergate was prosecuted and pursued, even though Richard Nixon won 49 states in the 1972 election. So using crimes to win a presidential election, that should be a question the House Judiciary Committee takes up next year.
Ken Dilanian, you've been following this, all of these cases closer than any of us on a daily basis for NBC News. What are the news items today in these filings? What are the things we learned today that we didn't know yesterday?
I think you've already articulated them, Lawrence, but just to emphasize the fact that federal prosecutors, not Michael Cohen, who stood up in court and said it before, but federal prosecutors are now endorsing the idea that Donald Trump ordered Michael Cohen to make illegal payments to women that were a violation of campaign finance law. Now, the issue with that law is that, unlike many laws, to convict somebody of it, you have to prove criminal intent. So sometimes ignorance of the law is no defense. In this case, it actually is. So it's not so simple as linking Trump to ordering the payment that makes him guilty of the crime. But nonetheless, it seems clear from the fact pattern. Michael Cohen is clearly saying he had criminal intent. He knew this was about protecting Donald Trump for the election, and he would testify at a trial. It seems pretty clear that that was Donald Trump's intent. And another piece of evidence of his criminal intent is that when this first came out, Donald Trump lied about it. He said he didn't know anything about the payments. And of course, the other big piece of news, which you alluded to, is the level of cooperation that Michael Cohen is providing on the heart of the investigation, which is Russia collusion. And it's not completely spelled out here, but it's not just about the Trump Tower Moscow. There are a number of issues here that are alluded to where Cohen talked to Mueller's office about contacts with Russians, and it goes into the White House. It also talks about Cohen dealing with people in the White House up until this year, and that is the first mention of Mueller coming into the current White House as opposed to the campaign. And the last thing I'll say, Lawrence, is that this document shows once and for all that Donald Trump lied, and I don't say that lightly as an objective reporter, when he said at the first news conference he held as president that he had no contacts with Russians and was aware of no one in his orbit that had any contacts with Russians during the campaign. Because clearly in September 2015, according to this court document, he conferred with Michael Cohen about reaching out to the Russian government about having a meeting with Vladimir Putin. It's right there in black and white. And for Donald Trump to say that this exonerates him is simply absurd.
Yeah, as you point out, Ken, there are several spots where the special prosecutor is saying Michael Cohen is basically telling us all about everyone he's ever talked to within Trump world about the Moscow project, and including conversations that he has had, as you said, going right into this year with the administration, people in the administration, going all the way into 2018. And also in Robert Mueller's sentencing memo for Michael Cohen today, he said the defendant provided information about his own contacts with Russian interests during the campaign and discussions with others. Who are those others? Discussions with others in the course of making those contacts. The defendant provided a detailed account of his involvement and the involvement of others. Which others in the Moscow project? Cohen described the circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries. Joining our discussion now, Michael Isikoff, who has been studying for years now the Trump involvements in Russia. And Michael, when you hear the special prosecutor today, read special prosecutors saying that Michael Cohen filled them in on his discussions with others about the Russian businesses, there could be a lot of others that they're talking about there.
Right. And what it only underscores for me is that this ought to be the responsibility of the Congress, because if we're relying purely on Mueller to get us the answers to these questions, I'm not sure we're going to get them. If you look really closely at the language in the Cohen sentencing memos, including the one by the special counsel, there's language that could have been used to flag the fact that they're going to use the information Cohen gave them to bring additional criminal cases. We saw it in the Flynn memo in a non-Russia matter, substantial assistance to the government. That's the key. They don't say that with Michael Cohen, including in Mueller's memorandum. There's nowhere where they say that Michael Cohen provided substantial assistance to the special counsel that will allow the special counsel to bring additional criminal cases. So all these unanswered questions that are out there, and I believe there are many, and we learned additional ones tonight as a result of these, I think Michael Cohen ought to be called by the House Judiciary Judiciary Committee, the House Intelligence Committee right away and testify openly in public about all of these matters. Then we can get some answers. Because if we keep waiting for Mueller, we may never get the answers to a lot of the questions you're raising.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.